First of all, I would like to thank the Institute for Ethnic Studies and especially Sonia and Lara for inviting me, and the Cost Action, which is one of the reasons why we are having a meeting in Ljubljana. I will try to present some things about the Charter, European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. Some of you may know most of the things, but I don't think that anybody knows all of the things that I present. So let's go and fasten seatbelts, as I usually say. The Council of Europe is sometimes not very well known in its history, but it was founded after the Second World War. For various reasons, because of the war, there were 6 men, elderly men, that actually tried to convince Europe that we need something of an international council. And you recognize some of the names very easily. For example, Winston Churchill, Konrad Adenauer, and Robert Schuman. And there were also other representatives of big countries participating in the foundation. These are actually called the founding fathers of the Council of Europe. And it's mainly focusing on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which are the 3 areas which they have specialized in the Council. And there are various secretariats and expert committees to deal with these issues. And the Council of Europe promotes human rights through international conventions, which is one of the reasons why the Charter is discussed here. The Charter was initiated actually in the 1980s, and the theoretical foundations of that process was mainly due to the research of Joshua Fishman and others in the field of sociology of language and the social linguistic area. But the Council of Europe has 47 states, or had 47 states. Now it's only 46 because Russia was kicked out from this cooperation in 2022. And there are also some kind of associated members, like for example Canada. The Charter is an international convention which is legally binding, which means that it's actually in legal force in the countries that ratify it. But it's only one of 130 conventions of the Council of Europe. There may be more now, because this is 1 or 2 years old, this presentation basis. It opened up for ratification in 1992, and it is in force since 1998, when you had enough countries that had ratified the Charter. There is a secretariat in Strasbourg in France, and of course it's difficult to understand why in Strasbourg, because it's very difficult to get there, but it's still working as a principle. And it's important to mention that this convention actually concerns the languages per se, not minorities. If you visit the website, it's very rich and it has all kinds of data that actually gives you the opportunity to get acquainted with the Charter. You find under this about the Charter, you find the text in itself in English and French, and then you have the states parties, their ratifications, and in the monitoring, which I'll be talking more about, you also have the evaluation reports by the Committee of Experts, which is, so to say, representing the 25 countries. And it's necessary to point out that the members of this committee are supposed to be independent, in the meaning that they are not supposed to follow what the embassies or the state authorities say about matters, but they should create their own views based on the text of the Charter. And you have various types of resources that you can also use. It's a very rich website. The basic principles of the European Charter of Regional Minority Languages, it is that it covers traditional, territorial, and non-territorial languages. This means that you have an old history among all of these languages, and the state is supposed to pick out the languages that they ratify for. The languages covered should differ from the dominating the official language, and the number of speakers should be smaller than that of the majority population. And there is one thing that should be also pointed out, that the protection should not negatively impact the official language. That is quite important, because the reason why states actually ratify this convention is that it doesn't create a threat to the official language. There should be negotiations with the speakers, and that is one compulsory part of the Charter. And the state should actually do their work proactively, which means that instead of waiting for initiatives among the NGOs or the organizations that represent the minorities, they should actually do something before that. And this is one of the main principles. It covers the language use in public and the private spheres. And the languages, the main aim is to keep the languages, minority languages, alive into the future as a part of European cultural heritage. And as I said before, it concerns the languages, not groups or speakers, but in practice it's difficult to actually promote the Charter without involving the speakers. So many of the recommendations concern the speakers, not the languages, even if we try to keep that in mind. And it's nowadays, since 2019, monitored every 5 years, like the Framework Convention, the other convention that covers minorities, but not minority languages. Since 2019, it was changed, the system was changed, so that nowadays you have a 3-year delivery of state reports, which is the basis for the work of monitoring what the states actually do. And there is also recommendations for immediate action, so-called RIAs, that are dealt with every 2.5 years. In principle, you can say that international law is stronger than national laws, but in practice, this does not, so to say, make sense, because national authorities usually claim that the national authority legislation is stronger than international law. So this thing that is legally binding is something that is challenging for the committee of experts. And one of the problems with this type of soft law in international convention is that sanctions are not possible. If there would be sanctions, it would be maybe easier to make states actually work to promote and protect the minority language that they have ratified for. This is probably some kind of map that you learned in 5th grade in primary school. It's unidimensional, and you don't see very much of variation in the different countries. Maybe you see variation in the sense that you have the names of the countries written in their own languages or major languages. But the reality that is dealt with in the Charter is more based on something other than this unidimensional map of linguistic diversity. These types of maps, they actually present the fact that the variation is actively hidden for more than 100 years. And the linguistic diversity is increasing and quite obvious today, and that is partly due to migration. But migration is not involved in the Charter. You have to have something like 4 or 5 generations of speakers before it's called traditional. And I think that the next point, newcomers and deviating representatives are not accepted today either, is quite strongly formulated, but I think it's true. So in the early days of the Charter existence, the variation was not easily accepted, and especially not the language dimension of it. And it hasn't changed very much today, because the migration in many states is so to say overruling the importance of the national or regional minority languages. And therefore you can say that age and folklore still hold status and the prestige in national context, which means the older the better in practice. And one question mark, or many question marks, concerns the different views on diversity today as a basis for cultural heritage. Is it on its way out for political reason, or is it just a lack of implementation for other political reasoning? And you can ask the question, what is taking place when you start pointing at and categorizing according to other principles than unidimensional maps? If you look at rights and sub-territories and census data, you have different kinds of results that the Charter has to deal with. This is more of a true picture of Europe. You have much more variation picked into the map, where you have many of the minority languages mapped on in their own states. But this is still maybe not enough, and some of the countries with a large variation regarding linguistic minorities are not members of the Council of Europe, like Russia, or have not ratified the Charter. Only 25 of the 46 countries have ratified the Charter, whereas the Framework Convention has been ratified by, if I remember correctly, 39 states. And this in this region is one of the reasons why the Charter is applicable, that you have historically very many different kinds of minorities under one empire. And when that empire gets lost or gets, so to say, obsolete, then you have a situation where the traditional or historical variation pops up and leads to discussions about protecting and promoting the languages in that area. The Council of Europe is not the only international organization that covers or tries to promote linguistic diversity in minority languages. Also, the European Union actually does this in its Article 22, but it's not very well known, and it's not very much used compared to the Charter and its implementation, because this is not monitored. And if you have some complaints about how the Article 22 is working, then you have to deal with that through court procedures. If you look at the process which the Committee of Experts follows, these 25 members of the committee, then you first have to read or get deeply in contact with the state reports, which usually more or less lie regarding the situation on ground. And if you look at what the NGOs say, then you have the other end of some kind of continuum, and the Committee of Experts has to try to draw its conclusions somewhere in between those two ends of the continuum. So the Committee of Experts, or the COMEX, monitors and reacts to the state reports and writes its own evaluation reports. The state reports are supposed to be delivered every 5 years, as I said, but it sometimes doesn't happen. Some countries do not deliver the state reports for various reasons, and some other countries actually do deliver them according to the Charter provisions. We also arrange on-the-spot visits with the working group that is, so to say, particularly selected for visiting the countries and interviewing the state authorities, regional authorities, local authorities, and the representatives of the speakers. So I have actually been in Slovenia twice in such a working group. That's many years ago, so things have changed, of course. And after these on-the-spot visits, some weeks after, we have full plenary meetings where we discuss the working group's results, so to say. And then we try to adopt this evaluation report, which is mostly done what do you call it? No? It's a word, Elin, you know which word I'm looking for, without any protest from anybody. Yeah. So the result of the 1 week meetings, usually maybe 2 days for a meeting on each state report, they are sort of say collectively accepted, and there are very seldom any objections to those evaluation reports. And that is then represented to the Committee of Ministers, which contains the foreign ministers of the Council member states. And in some countries you have 9 rounds already going on, and that is Norway in the first line. And then the Committee of Ministers take a decision, and it publishes a critique that contains maybe 3 to 7 recommendations to the state. But on the other hand, the evaluation reports, which were before 2019 quite extensive, are now, so to say, collecting the other types of recommendations for the states. And there is some kind of cooperation with the Framework Convention, and there is an eager willingness in the Council that we, so to say, combine the on-the-spot visits between the Charter working groups and the Framework Convention working groups. The Charter staff, so to say, you see the present director of the Secretariat, Elise Kornio, and to the right you see also Vesna Čirnić-Grotić, who is from Croatia, an international law expert and the former chair of the committee. We participate in various types of other events and working groups and projects and so on. So it's not only about dealing with the monitoring. I think I will skip this one, but the heading of this slide is quite important, because within the field of linguistics, identity studies and cultural studies, there is an increasing willingness to look at something that is called sometimes dynamic and liquid, like identity, and multidimensional. But for the Charter purposes, we need some kind of fairly stable definition of language. Not so much about identity and ethnicity and things like that, but the understanding that language is, instead of being used or processed, is important for the working of international and national law. And you have down at the end, you have some of the fields that are covered by the Charter. It's education, cultural policy, media policy, labor market legislation, and so on. I'll come back to this aspect. The Charter structure is like this, and mostly the general provisions are maybe not so well known, but it's important to understand how the Charter works. You have part 2 and part 3 that are quite important for the understanding of how to monitor the Charter. So in part 2 you have some objectives and principles that are entered into article, or according to Article 2. There has been a shift in the text, I have to check that. Well, there is Article 7 that is quite important for the part 2 recommendations and monitoring. And Article 7 is more or less, so to say, targeting the non-territorial languages, but it also covers the part 3 languages, which I'll come back to, in the whole country or in the whole state, but the part 3 obligations are, so to say, valid in selected areas. So you have Articles 8 to 14 under Part 3, and these are the main articles for the languages that have been ratified according to Part 3. And I'll come back to both Sweden and Slovenia regarding this. But education is seen as one of the most important factors that is needed in order to protect and promote minority language. Then you have judicial authorities, administration and public services, and the media, cultural affairs, economic and social life, and transfrontier exchanges. And these have been seen as very important since the 1980s in the founding phase of the Charter. The states then have to select the languages, but they also have to select which languages come under Part 3. And for these languages, you have to select 35 undertakings out of 68, which, so to say, are fulfilled for the languages under this part and this ratification. And in ways you can look at this from another angle. Sweden ratified the Charter in 2000, and it entered into force in 2000 as well. Slovenia ratified the Charter in 2000, and it entered into force in 2001. And this already points at the differences in different countries, so how things are dealt with. And in Sweden you have Finnish, Sami, Meänkieli, Romani and Yiddish that are covered by the Charter, but Yiddish and Romani under Part 2 and the other 3 languages under Part 3. And in Slovenia you have Part 2 languages, Croatian, German, Romani and Serbian, and whereas Hungarian and Italian are covered by Part 3. That's more demanding and more detailed protection for these 2 languages. And for Romani and Yiddish in Sweden and for Romani in Slovenia, you have a 7.5, which is, so to say, covering how it will be applied, the monitoring and the ratification instrument for these languages. This is one of the results. It's a bit of an old map, but this is one of the results of the Swedish ratification. You have something that is called administrative areas for Sami, Meänkieli and Finnish. But the groups are different, and then you have the Sami people, Tornedalians and Sweden Finns. So the ethnicity part and the language part differ to some extent, both in the national legislation and in the Charter. This is the challenge for the Committee of Experts, because here you see what the state is possible, or what is possible for the state to actually ratify under this Part 3. And you have different options, and it's sometimes called the menu for states to choose among these different undertakings. And I have put in block letters the provisions under education, preschool and primary school, that is covered by Sweden. And you can say easily by actually visually controlling this that it's the weakest protection for the Part 3 languages. And the big difference in the educational options is that you have education in the language or education of the language, which can take place in the official language then, of course. And regarding education, you can see what the situation is for the 5 national minority languages. The blue line on top is for Finnish, and the other 4 languages are covered by the other colors. And this is until 2018-19 school year. In Sweden, there is a problem that you have the amount of people that are eligible for mother tongue instruction, which is the full line on top, and you have those who participate in the educational possibilities for the minority languages under that. And you can see that there is during the years there has been a very strong difference between those who are eligible and those who are participating. And this is a challenge, of course, for the Swedish educational system, but there are other things that, so to say, connect to this. And in Sweden, compared to Slovenia, bilingual education, which is the term that is being used, is very rare, and it's only for Sami and Finnish. And for the other languages, even under Part 3, there is no education in the language, like Meänkieli. That's Meänkieli. And you have municipal schools that provide some kind of bilingual education, which is quite rare. And then you have independent school, which is somehow a private school system, but which is funded by the state or the municipalities. And then you have a state school for Sami, which is bilingual until the year 6. There are big holes in this educational system or structure. And what has happened during the last, let's say, 25 years is that since the early 90s, with the situation in the Balkan and the refugee waves that came from other parts of the globe, Middle East and Africa, is that Finnish used to be bigger than all other languages counted together till the 1990s. And now it's not even among the 10 greatest languages that are provided mother tongue instruction, which is 1 to 2 hours per week. So there are demographic changes that is based on, or that are based on the demographic changes or the migration and waves that have occurred during the last decades. And Arabic is the biggest language, and you have 53,000 pupils that participate in this, and you have 75,000 that are eligible. And then if you go to the bottom, you have Polish, for example, with 9,000 eligible students or pupils and 5,000 that attend the education. And you see the percentages that are outside school time, which is a problem for this type of education, that they are not part of the so to say obligatory school day. The teaching takes place according to the percentages you see here after the school day, which is of course very detrimental for the teaching of the languages and for the teachers. In 2022-23 we started getting statistics about the educational provisions for the different languages. And that was complained about for many years before the National Board of Education actually got the directives from the government to collect the data like this. So 23 years almost passed after the ratification. Well, I think I will comment. And if you look at the media, you have the same, let's say, forest of options for media provisions. In Sweden you have these ones covered by the 3 languages under Part 3. And you can see that again it's the lower the position of this option is, the more difficult it is to actually for the national minorities to make sense of the provision and the protection of the languages in the media. So for the 3 languages you have A3 to make adequate provision so that broadcasters offer programs in the regional minority languages. And we'll come back to this when we deal with Slovenia. And there is a separate option then for Finnish to encourage and facilitate the creation of at least 1 television channel in the regional minority languages. And this is one of the challenges for the Committee of Experts. How do you define encourage and facilitate? So we have to deal with this, and in the recommendations we also try to use the same vocabulary, and then it's thrown back at the state authorities to deal with that type of recommendation. But it's quite difficult to at the same time have a stable field of recommendations which are supposed to be dynamic also according to changing situations for the languages. You see that under Article 11, Part 3 is missing, or the Article 11.3 is missing for the Part 3 languages in Sweden. It's about television programs and television channel for Finnish audio and audiovisual works, and facilitate the creation and or maintenance of at least 1 newspaper. And there is 1 newspaper exactly. So when the ratification, so to say, picks up on these options, it usually ends up in or maybe not usual, but sometimes it ends up in actually providing only one when there is the requirement of having at least one. In the recommendations of the committee of experts that are then provided for usually for the committee of ministers, we have some repeated recommendations, and they all concern education, and that has been going on now for 8 reports for the Charter regarding Sweden and education in minority languages. But we also have this language as a ground for discrimination in the Swedish legislation, which we try to require then, but so far nothing has happened there. And all of these things that have been underlined need to be clarified, at least for the committee of experts. What does it mean to have language as a ground for discrimination? The Swedish authorities say that it's enough to have ethnicity, which is not the same as language, because some of the minority groups do not care about ethnicity as much as they care about language discrimination. And then we have to define more or less mother tongue in education, and adequate language tuition, and achieve mature literacy. And the bilingual education, what is that? Is mother tongue instruction bilingual education, which some municipalities claim, or is it not? And make available preschool education in or a substantial part of preschool education in the language. And training according to the needs of the speakers and to the situation of each of the minority languages. These are fairly open-ended recommendations that the state authorities receive. And what we do in the evaluation reports is to define much clearer what is actually requested by the state authorities. So if you look at Slovenia's ratification about education and media, then we will see that you see already here for the Italian language in paragraph 1, you have the strongest options chosen by the Slovenian state authorities. That's number 1 for preschool A and the primary school B and secondary school C. And for the Hungarian language, you have a lower level of protection and promotion in school, in education. You have the number 2, and the according to actually in preschool number 2 and primary school number 2 and secondary school 2. And for the media, the Italian and Hungarian languages are protected in a similar way. But the website of the Council of Europe actually states that the state authorities may opt to facilitate the creation of a radio station or a TV channel, or to just encourage the broadcasting of programs in this language. And there is a huge difference, and according to the ratification instrument, it's useless sometimes for the NGOs to demand things that go beyond the ratification instrument, which is a problem, of course, because in the national context it may be quite obvious that you need more for Hungarian in order to protect and promote it, and according to the same principles as for Italian. And you can see here now that the block options are chosen for Italian, to make available preschool education in, and primary school to make available primary education in the relevant regional minority language. So they have chosen the strongest option. For Hungarian, it's the second strongest, to make available substantial part of preschool education in, and to make available a substantial part in primary school or education as well. And then you have to define what is a substantial part. Is it 50%, 60%, 70% to be provided in the language, or what is it? State authorities may claim that 30% is enough, and the NGOs may claim that it's 70% that qualifies as the substantial part. For media, the Slovenian authorities in the ratification instrument demanded that they choose A1 to ensure the creation of at least one radio station and one television channel in both languages, and the EI or E1 to encourage or to facilitate the creation or maintenance of at least one newspaper. But you also have here the guarantee freedom of direct reception of radio and television broadcasts from neighboring countries, and the part that was missing for the Swedish ratification, 11.3, the parties undertake to ensure that interests of the users of regional minority languages are represented or taken into account within such bodies that are dealing with the broadcasting of minority languages. And this is the example from 2019 for the Committee of Ministers' recommendations to Slovenia. And this is also a possibility for the Committee of Experts to recommend which language should be, so to say, protected and promoted by the state authorities in question. So you have Croatian, German and Serbian are recommended to be recognized, which takes or needs some kind of official recognition of that from the state authorities. And develop the teaching of the Romani language and culture at all appropriate levels. And then again, we have to define what is appropriate levels. And intensify measures to raise public awareness in mainstream education and in the mass media. There has been no mention of the media in the Swedish context, but here it's picked up as one important part of the recommendation. And also in the point 4, ensure sufficient resources for the provision of television programs in Hungarian and Italian. I think I will skip this part. I can just say that there are unique languages covered by the Charter, and it's about 50 different languages. Unique in the sense that in the ratifying parties or state parties, these languages have no recognized official minority status in other ratifying states. And you have, for example, in let's see what Slovenia is not on the list. Sweden is with Finnish and meänkieli, and Finland is with Inari, Sami, Karelian and Swedish, and so on. But I leave the presentation with the organizers so you can have a closer look at this. There are other ways to deal with the ratification instrument. This is in Finnish, which I sort of say kept because I thought it's interesting for you to see how Finnish deals with these things. But the problem is that when the ratification instrument is being dealt with by different states, Poland, for example, Puola, they ratified under Part 3 for Armenian, Belarusian, Czech, German, Karaim, Kashubian, Lemko, Lithuanian, Romani, Russian, Slovakian, Tatar, Ukrainian, and Yiddish, and also Hebrew. And this raises questions sometimes in some states. Why is not Hebrew included under the ratification of other states? And the view has been, at least until now, that Hebrew is a modern language that is not traditionally used in most of the countries. So therefore we don't deal with Hebrew in Poland. But the problem is that they ratified for all these languages under Part 3. And you have, for example, Karaim, which has no speakers. And if you are supposed to provide an educational system for Karaim, that's rather useless. And in the other countries, Slovenia, for example, has Bosnian, Italian, Romani, Croatian, Serbian, German, and Hungarian. And the two in block letters are under Part 3. This is another way of putting it. German is one of the most widespread minority languages in Europe. Romani is probably the most widespread. I think it's in 14 states that it has some kind of official recognition. And you can see in which countries it's only under Part 2 and in which countries under Part 3. In order to give you some picture of the number of speakers, which we sometimes discuss because we sometimes say in the Committee of Experts, it doesn't matter how many speakers you have, it's supposed to be protected as part of the European cultural heritage. So if you have 9 speakers of Tatar, it's just as valuable as German that has 200,000 speakers, according to the ratification instrument. But these are figures that, so to say, give you a picture of the variety of speakers, on the amount of speakers. And it's usually, you can see in the bottom that it's 0.7% of the whole population that are speakers of these minority languages. But they are still seen as very important for the European cultural heritage. I think it's enough to just say that the language diversification is one of the effects of the Charter. So when Sweden ratified for Sami, it was only for one language. But nowadays you have it divided into North Sami, which is some type of majority Sami, and Lule Sami and South Sami with something like 600, 700 speakers, and then Pite Sami and Ume Sami, which are not included in the ratification and not dealt with by the Committee of Experts. They have something like 50, 60 speakers, mostly elderly. So this type of diversification is an effect of the Charter, that you have increasingly some kind of attitudes towards languages, and when you get more information, knowledge about the language situation, then you start dealing with different languages under the, so to say, heading like Sami. So you can say that it's slow but obvious, the impact in most states. It's difficult to actually claim that it's clear, but it takes place some kind of development in different states that have ratified it. And the weight of the Charter and the Framework Convention, they vary, or it varies in different countries. So in Sweden, the Charter is more important than the Framework Convention is seen as. It's a low degree of implementation in many states. Cooperation with speakers varies quite a lot. One of the main results, I think, is this, that the minority NGOs, non-governmental organizations, become more educated in language policy matters according to what they experienced during now 25 years of Swedish ratification of the Charter. And you also have some sorts of national legal acts as a result. Language Act in 2009 in Sweden, and Law on National Minorities, Minority Language in 2010. So these are effects of the application or the implementation of the Charter. I should also say hvala, but I didn't remember the word here. So thank you.